she was never the kind of woman who sought the spotlight. Most days, you'd find her with oil-stained hands and a wrench in her back pocket, hair tucked beneath a faded ball cap, working quietly beneath the belly of a rescue helicopter no one else dared to touch. To the outside world, she was just a mechanic, unassuming, practical, the kind of person people overlooked until something broke. But there was a stillness in her, a gravity, as if her silence wasn't emptiness, but something earned. Her name didn't hang on the wall like others. There were no framed medals, no photos of her in uniform saluting beneath a flag. But those who had been around long enough knew that years ago, she flew with a kind of precision you couldn't teach. Medevac pilot, Afghanistan, 2009. Night missions. Mountain extractions under fire. She never talked about it. Maybe she was trying to forget, or maybe she was carrying memories too heavy to share. Either way, she didn't correct people when they assumed she was just a mechanic. In fact, she preferred it that way. Let them underestimate her. She moved through the hangar like part of the machine itself, efficient, unnoticed, necessary. Young pilots would walk past her, too focused on their flight briefings to acknowledge the woman who once flew circles around the storms they now feared. She didn't resent it. There was a strange peace in being invisible. But every now and then, late at night when the hangar lights dimmed and the wind howled against the doors, you could catch her standing beside a grounded chopper, fingertips grazing its cold frame like she was remembering something only she and that aircraft understood. No one knew it then, but the storm was coming, one that would ground every certified pilot, snap comm towers like matchsticks, and test the very soul of their unit. And when it hit, it wouldn't be the uniformed or the decorated who stepped forward. It would be the woman with the wrench and the quiet eyes, the one everyone thought was just the mechanic. The sky changed without warning. What had begun as a cold, gray morning quickly turned into something brutal, something alive. Thick sheets of snow began to fall in angry spirals, slamming against the hangar windows like fists. The wind howled with a voice that didn't sound like weather, it sounded like warning. Radios crackled with static, then silence, then frantic voices from outposts up in the mountains, their signals warping through the blizzard. A man, 63 years old, congestive heart failure, was stranded in a remote cabin 10,000 feet up, barely clinging to life. The ground teams couldn't reach him. Roads had vanished under white. Snowmobiles were useless. It was a helicopter mission or nothing. Life or death. Inside the flight room, tension gathered like frost. The mission request came down from command, immediate medevac extraction required. All certified pilots assembled, each one seasoned, each one aware of what it meant to fly into that kind of storm. One by one, they shook their heads. Not out of cowardice, but out of brutal, clinical truth. The winds were too volatile. The ridgelines were blind. Instruments would freeze. If a chopper went up, it likely wouldn't come back down intact. Not unless the pilot was either reckless or touched by something more than training, something feral, something instinctive. She stood at the edge of the room, still in her coveralls, silent, unnoticed as always. Until she stepped forward. "I'll go." The room fell silent, as if her words had cut the storm itself. For a moment, no one moved. No one even breathed. She wasn't on the rotation. She wasn't even cleared to fly this model anymore, not since she transitioned to maintenance. But she didn't flinch. Didn't ask for permission. She simply looked at the commanding officer with eyes like steel beneath the snow. "I know this terrain. I know that bird. And I've flown worse." There was something in her voice, something that reached beyond protocol. Not defiance. Not pride. Just certainty. The kind of certainty that came from remembering what it was like to fly into places knowing you might not fly out. The commanding officer hesitated, then nodded. Not because he wanted to, but because deep down, they all knew, this woman, the one they had walked past 100 times without really seeing, was the only one who might stand a chance. She turned and walked toward the hangar without another word, her boots echoing against concrete as the storm screamed louder, as if trying to stop her. But it was already too late. The mechanic was already gone. The pilot had returned. She moved through the hangar like a woman haunted by memory but unshaken by fear. The snow outside had thickened into a white wall, erasing the world inch by inch, but inside her, beneath the calm grip of her hands and the even rhythm of her breath, something old had awakened. Something she hadn't felt in years. She climbed into the pilot's seat without hesitation, fingers moving across the console with the reverence of someone touching a long-lost friend. This wasn't just metal and rotor blades to her. It was an extension of her. It was the only place in the world that ever made sense. The helicopter was an older model, temperamental, underpowered, high maintenance, but she knew every creak in its frame, every complaint in its hydraulics. She'd kept it alive when others had written it off. Now it was returning the favor, trusting her to bring it into the heart of chaos. As the rotors began to spin, the other crew members gathered. A young medic, barely 30, looked at her with a mix of disbelief and reverence. He had heard the stories, whispers, really, about what she used to be. About what she had done. He didn't ask questions. He just strapped in, lips pressed into a silent prayer. The moment the skids lifted off the ground, there was no turning back. Visibility dropped to near zero the second they cleared the hangar. The storm slammed into them like a living thing, clawing at the windshield, screaming through the rotors. Warnings lit up the dash like a Christmas tree, icing alerts, wind shear, terrain proximity, but she barely blinked. Her hands were steady, eyes fixed on a world no one else could see. There was no GPS reliable enough for this. No autopilot that could read the ridges. Only her instincts, her memory, and a kind of focused fury that made every second stretch long and sharp. She pushed the aircraft harder than anyone should have. Climbed when she should have turned. Dropped into valleys so narrow the rotors kissed the treetops. She rode the wind like it was a beast she tamed once before and dared now to rise again. There were moments when the snow was so dense it felt like drowning, when the chopper groaned and shuddered under the pressure, but she never yielded. Not because she thought she would survive, but because someone out there was dying, waiting for the sound of salvation, and no one else had come. Every mile forward was a challenge to the sky itself. Every second was a defiance of limits, not just mechanical, but human. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to fly. But some people don't wait for permission when lives are at stake. Some people don't believe in supposed to. And so she kept going, higher, deeper, into the storm's broken heart, her jaw clenched, her pulse steady, until even the storm had to admit it couldn't stop her. It felt less like flying and more like fighting the wind, the cold, the mountain itself. The storm didn't want them there. It roared through the canyons with a voice full of teeth, slamming into the fuselage with every gust, trying to tear them off course, trying to break them apart midair. Snow wrapped around the windshield in endless white spirals, erasing the horizon, blinding every familiar landmark. Trees below became jagged shadows. The ridgelines were knives waiting to be misread. Every move she made had to be perfect, or it would be their last. Inside the cockpit, breath fogged the glass and sweat clung to her brow despite the cold. The only sound louder than the storm was the engine whining in protest, pushed to its limits, but she tuned it out. Her world had narrowed to the instruments, the wind's rhythm, and the shape of the land she remembered not with her eyes but with her bones. She was reading the terrain like Braille, feeling the way the air shifted around a drop, how the rotors strained before a cliff face appeared, trusting a sense that no training manual could teach. Behind her, the medic gripped the seat's edge, white-knuckled but silent. He knew better than to interrupt. He had seen what she was doing and understood, instinctively, that they were in the presence of something rare. Not luck. Not madness. Mastery. And faith, the kind of faith that can't be borrowed, only earned the hard way, in nights like this one. A warning tone shrieked as they rounded a wind-swept bend, a ridge rising out of nowhere like a wall of death. She yanked the stick with just enough force to slide above it, the tail rotor clearing by inches. The chopper shuddered violently, dipped, then steadied. The medic swore under his breath. She didn't even flinch. Her lips were pressed tight, eyes locked forward, as if she'd left part of herself behind in another war, and that part had taken the fear with it. Then, through the curtain of white, the cabin came into view, a tiny speck buried beneath a dome of snow. Smoke from the chimney told them someone was still alive. She slowed the descent, maneuvering with aching care. One wrong angle and they'd either crash or trigger an avalanche. The chopper's skids touched down like a whisper. The storm didn't let up, it just screamed louder, angry that it had failed to stop her. She kept the rotors running, ready for a fast exit, as the medic leapt out and fought his way through the drifts to the door. Inside, the patient was barely breathing, skin pale, lips blue, oxygen mask frozen over. Time wasn't running out. It had already run out. They were chasing the last seconds. She stayed focused on the controls, eyes scanning the storm like a wolf at the edge of the woods, guarding her pack. She didn't think about the return flight. She didn't think about whether they'd make it back. In moments like this, there's no room for what-ifs. Only the mission. Only the life on the line. And the resolve of a woman who never should have been in that seat, but who, on that night, was the only one in the world who could have made it there. And somehow, impossibly, she did. The moment they lifted off again, the storm closed in tighter, as if it had been waiting. The helicopter shuddered beneath the weight of the wind and the cold, groaning like something alive, like something begging her to turn back. But she didn't. Couldn't. The patient was strapped in now, barely clinging to life, and four-line trembling in the medic's frozen hands. His breathing was shallow. His pulse flickering. They weren't just racing a blizzard, they were racing death itself. Visibility was gone. Instruments were icing over. The horizon was nothing but white swallowing white, and yet somehow she kept going. Every minute felt eternal, suspended between worlds, one of bone-deep cold and one of fire-hot purpose. Her hands gripped the controls like she was holding on to more than just the machine, like she was holding on to fate. Every tilt, every correction was a prayer disguised as movement. Halfway down the mountain, the radio cut in, a garbled voice, the base tower trying to make contact. For the first time in what felt like hours, something other than the storm spoke. She replied with calm, controlled words, as if she weren't dancing on the edge of the impossible. They didn't need to know what she was flying through. They just needed to prepare for when she landed. But even then, with the valley floor still far below, something changed. The clouds broke, just for a moment. A single crack in the sky, like the world itself was pausing to look. Through that narrow gap, moonlight spilled down like grace, silvering the mountains and painting the snow in quiet light. It wasn't bright. It wasn't long. But it was enough. Enough to see the pass, enough to adjust course by a fraction, enough to breathe. It felt like the storm blinked, and in that blink, she slipped through. The medic looked at her then, eyes wide not just with relief, but with awe. There was something in her silence that humbled even the miracle. She didn't speak. Didn't smile. Just flew. When they finally touched down at the base, the medical team rushed to the helicopter, pulling the patient from the back and into warm arms, warm light, and machines that beeped instead of screamed. The man would live. Barely. But he would live. No one cheered. No one clapped. There was only the sound of rotors slowing, the metal cooling, the storm retreating behind her like a beast denied its prey. She shut down the engine slowly, methodically, like she was closing a chapter no one else could read. Then she stepped down from the cockpit, covered in sweat and frost, hands trembling now that the danger had passed. A few people stared. A few whispered. But she didn't stay to hear it. She walked back into the hangar like she always did, quiet, invisible, the mechanic once more. But something had changed. And no one would ever look at her the same way again. After the rush of adrenaline faded and the cold began to seep into her bones, she found herself alone in the dim glow of the empty hangar. The storm was finally dying down outside, but inside, a different kind of silence settled, one heavy with relief, exhaustion, and something harder to name. She didn't join the quick debriefs or the flood of congratulations whispered behind closed doors. Instead, she slipped away from the crowd, retreating to a small corner where the shadows clung to the walls like old friends. There, leaning against the worn metal frame of the helicopter she had fought so fiercely to fly through the blizzard, she let herself breathe. The wrench in her pocket felt heavier now, a weight full of memories and unspoken truths. Her hands, still trembling slightly from the cold and tension, grazed the cold surface of the aircraft, tracing familiar lines as if to reassure herself that it was real, that she had really done it. Not just the flight, but the impossible rescue. Her mind wandered to the man they saved, the fragile thread of life she had carried through the storm. She thought of his family, waiting and praying somewhere in the cold night, and of the countless others she had never met but silently vowed to protect. It wasn't heroism she felt, not in the way the world would name it. It was something quieter, a deep, steady current of purpose, the kind that anchors a soul in the darkest moments. Tears she hadn't known were held back slipped down her cheeks, warm against the icy air. It was not pride. It was release. The release of years carrying a burden alone, the release of proving to herself that the woman in the mechanic's jumpsuit was more than just a shadow. She was a pilot, a savior, a force of nature disguised in coveralls. For a long while, she stayed there, wrapped in that fragile, sacred silence, the world outside still roaring but distant. And though no one was watching, in that quiet moment, she finally saw herself, not as just a mechanic, but as someone who had flown through hell and come home, forever changed but unbroken. She walked out of the hangar as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the frost-covered tarmac. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered, whispers in the wind, the cold bite in the air, and the weight of what had just happened settling deep in her chest. Around her, life stirred back to normal, crews gathering for morning briefings, engines warming up, radios buzzing with routine chatter. Yet none of it seemed to touch her. She moved like a ghost among them, seen but unseen, a silent witness to her own quiet triumph. No headlines would be written about her that day. No medals pinned to her chest. The world outside would remember the blizzard, the stranded man, the impossible flight. But they wouldn't see the woman who defied limits, who soared through the storm not for glory but because it was the only choice, because someone needed her to be brave when others couldn't. She was the mechanic who became the pilot, the shadow who became the light, the invisible thread holding a fragile life together. As she paused by the helicopter one last time, her fingers brushed the cold metal with a tenderness that spoke of respect and farewell. The machine had carried her through the storm, but it was the fire inside her that had truly kept them alive. She didn't look back. Instead, she turned toward the rising sun, steps steady and sure, carrying a story untold but etched in every line of her face. She would return to her quiet life, to the unglamorous work of fixing machines, of keeping others safe in ways no one noticed. But somewhere deep inside, a new certainty burned, a reminder that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's a quiet resolve, a steady heartbeat in the dark, an unyielding spirit that refuses to break. And in that, she became something more than a mechanic. She became a symbol, a silent hero whose story whispered through the cold winds long after the storm had passed.